And I think that I just have to respectfully go, have a good life.
No one questioned it for so long. Emotional labor flowed like background noise, quietly, invisibly around. Unthanked and unnamed, it was just expected. Someone would siphon off tension before it became conflict. Someone would soften words before they turned sharp. And someone would translate moods, would anticipate reactions, smooth over misunderstandings, carry emotional weight so no one else had to. And because it was done quietly, it was mistaken for personality instead of effort. She was just good at keeping the peace. She had been naturally nurturing, strong, and she was emotionally intelligent. What no one said, not out loud at least, was that she was tired. Emotional labor, when it's free, becomes invisible. And when it's invisible, it becomes limitless. There is always more expected. More patience, more understanding, more flexibility, more forgiveness. The system grows dependent on it, the way a structure grows dependent on an unseen support beam. No one notices the beam until it's removed. This, for years, was how the emotional economy worked. One person carries more so that everyone else can carry less. One person adjusts so others don't have to. One person pays the emotional cost up front, again and again and again, without reimbursement. It was never the problem that emotional labor existed. It was work left unpaid, unrequired by its receivers, and therefore assumed. But at first, it had not felt like exploitation. It felt like love. It felt like responsibility. It felt like maturity. She had told herself that being the emotional glue meant she was essential, needed, valuable. And in some ways, that had been true. The whole system relied on her ability to keep things from falling apart. Yet dependence does not entail respect. And then, over time, something more subtle began to shift. Not with any great show and tell, not all at once. It began with exhaustion she couldn't explain, a heaviness that hung after conversations, an idea that no matter how much she gave, the baseline never shifted. There was no arrival point where things were easier. The work was endless. She began to observe that when she stopped anticipating emotions, problems popped up in a second. If she didn't pad a message, it hit too hard. If she didn't step in to referee, an argument heated up. If she didn't reassure, insecurity proliferated. Hers was the unyielding labor damming back emotional chaos. And that realization was both empowering and devastating. Empowering, for it showed her how much she carried. Devastating, because it showed her how little was being carried in return. The first crack came not from anger, but from curiosity. She wondered what would happen if she didn't interfere, as not a punishment, neither an act of rebellion, but merely as an experiment, to pause for a moment and see if the system would support itself. So she didn't explain one day. She didn't explain somebody else's intention. She didn't apologize for someone who hurt her. She never sopped up discomfort to keep the peace. She waited. And then everything changed. The silence was turning unsettling. Tension immediately came to the surface. People looked around, confused almost, as if something essential was missing. Conversations came to an awkward halt. Emotions escalated. The system fumbled, not because something new was happening, but because something familiar was gone. Labor. Until then, she didn't want to look and see the reality. The harmony wasn't organic. It was manufactured. Manufactured through her effort, her regulation, her emotional translation. She wasn't only participating in that system, she was powering it. And power, when it's unrecognized, becomes exploitation. It didn't make her angry straight off. That made her sad. Sad over just how long she'd given when no one bothered to check if she still could. Sad for how deep she had internalized the sense of responsibility for other people's emotions. Sad over how often she'd mixed emotional endurance with emotional strength. She started noticing things she had normalized before. How often she was called on to listen, but seldom listened to. How often she was called to adapt, but seldom catered to. How much she was supposed to comprehend, yet hardly ever comprehended. The imbalance was not an accident. It was structural. And structures don't change unless the labor sustaining them does. That's when emotional labor stopped being free. Not announced, not required, not weaponized. It simply did not just become automatic anymore. She didn't stop caring, that's important. She didn't go cold or detached. She just stopped subsidizing everybody else's comfort at the expense of her own. She started asking herself a new question. prior to stepping in emotionally. Is this mine to carry? Most of the time, the response was no. At first, the withholding felt uncomfortable, almost wrong. She had been taught that to love was to be available, to care was to be responsive, to be mature meant to silently absorb pain. Saying no, even to herself, seemed a violation of the rule she had never agreed to but always kept. The system started responding straight away. People noticed it before they made sense of it. They felt unsupported, unsettled. They said she was distant, different, colder. What they were feeling was the lack of a service they had come to rely on, without any recognition. They didn't miss her. They didn't miss the labor. And that distinction hurt. When emotional labor is free, it's taken for granted. When it's withdrawn, it's suddenly noticed, but often resented. The people who relied on it most couldn't adjust the quickest. They were used to emotional convenience, used to someone else doing the work of regulation, empathy, and repair. Now they were being asked quietly to do that work themselves. Many didn't know how to. This was the source of tension, not because she changed, but because the system was now being called upon to mature. For years, emotional labor had masked the fact that nobody was getting held accountable for much of anything. With it gone, patterns were finally exposed. Conflict didn't have to mean that something was wrong. It meant something was finally visible. She began seeing how often emotional crises were manufactured to pull her back into service, how guilt was used to trigger her caretaking instinct, how accusations of selfishness appeared the moment she prioritized herself. But this time, she didn't race to correct those perceptions. She existed with them. And in doing so, she learned something powerful. Discomfort doesn't kill relationships. Avoiding responsibility does. The cost of free emotional labor had always been paid by one person. Now the cost, being redistributed, was felt for the first time. Some rose to the occasion. They learned to talk with one another instead of always using her as a translator. They learned how to self-regulate instead of offloading emotions. They learned to fix rather than to divert. Those relationships deepened. Others opposed. They wanted the old version of her back. They framed her boundaries as abandonment. They tried shaming her to resume the role. Those relationships were strained. This wasn't punishment. It was a recalibration. The moment emotional labor was no longer free, it became visible. And the instant it became visible, it could be priced, bargained over, or refused. It wasn't unlimited. It was a form of energy that cost. That change shifted the whole emotional economy. The story everybody had been living inside, where harmony was expected without effort, where peace was maintained by one person's exhaustion, could no longer survive. Not because it was challenged, but that is because it was no longer subsidized. And this was just the beginning. For once emotional labor has a price, the system needs to make up its mind about paying or collapsing without emotional labor.
So, when emotional labor ceased to be free, a state of confusion dawned on the system. Not a state of collapse, but a state of confusion. The sort that arises when a vital part is missing, but nobody has a clue what to substitute it with. It is a state that is experienced before the reason is known. It is a sense that is experienced before it is consciously articulated. It is a state that is palpable when there is a sense of resistance, rather than a smooth flow. For the first time, people were sitting with their own discomfort. And discomfort has a way of revealing areas for improvement. The system had never demanded it before. It had always worked on a compensation system, where one member of the system is competent emotionally to offset the lack of competence in the rest. Now that compensation mechanism ceased, the lack of competence stood bare. They could not describe how they felt without being accused of it. They equated honesty with hostility. The outsourcing of the emotional infrastructure had been ongoing for such a long time that nobody knew how it worked anymore. Initially, denial ensued. This isn't how you used to be. You've changed. You're being difficult. You're making things harder than they need to be. These are not observations, but protests, the attempts to reinstate the previous order, but not address why that order existed in the first instance. But once reclaimed, the labor of emotion doesn't go back into unpaid service. She listened to the grievances, she felt the pressure, but something deep within her had changed. She no longer saw other people's unease as her problem. She saw it, correctly, for what it was, a growing pain. It is rarely an easy process when growth occurs in a system that has been based on convenience. She started to realize how easily people demanded emotional results with themselves putting in no effort emotionally. How quickly a lack of immediacy and happiness led to irritation with a lack of immediate unity. In the past, she would have intervened, remedied the situation, clarified the viewpoints, taken the blame. This time, she did not move. Not passive, deliberate. That stillness was misinterpreted as a withdrawal, as punishment, as a lack of interest. But it wasn't.
It's a deliberate choice to not overfunction. Overfunctioning had been the engine of the system. She did more work so that others might do less. She read people's needs so that others would not have to see them. She managed people's feelings so that others might avoid responsibility. Lastly, she now allowed other people to feel the natural effects of lack of emotional nurturing. These had significant implications. Some people were really surprised by how much work there is in emotional maintenance, she said. They had no idea how many tiny things happened behind the scenes, how many conversations were pre-processed, how many feelings were filtered before they arrived. You're never going to be in a situation where a third party is filtering your emotions. Other people are filtering your emotions all the time in order to protect themselves from your negative feelings. This layer protected them. In addition, exposure leads to defensiveness. Others started to see how far they could push her. They pushed subtly. They made bids that were emotionally charged, attempts to pull her back on board. They dramatized disputes. They suggested that things would go terribly wrong unless she stepped in. But sometimes, yes, they came apart. This, of course, didn't mean that she had done something negative. This implied that the system has been vulnerable all along. She started realizing that stability had been performative. It had been a result of maintenance, not a reliance on mutual responsibility. The instant the presence of maintenance appeared, the price tag surfaced. This came with a strange combination of sadness and relief. Sorrow for the years she had lived believing she herself was the problem. Relief, at least knowing she wasn't. She had been bearing the burden of emotional labor, not because she was exceptionally competent, but because she was exceptionally willing, ready to suffer in order to spare someone else the distress, ready to surrender logic for the sake of unity, ready to take the blame in order to maintain a relationship. This openness had been taken advantage of, not always with ill intent, but always. Now, once she pulled back on that willingness, the relationships had no choice but to expose what they were really built on. Some surprised her. There are people who recognized the change and reacted with curiosity rather than defensiveness. They questioned rather than accused. They accepted responsibility rather than playing the blame game. They learned how to remain with the discomfort rather than outsourcing it. These ties strengthened. They evolved to become more rounded, more authentic, less draining. The labor of emotions became a team effort, not a solo responsibility. The work of care translated to accountability, not privilege. But other ties failed. These were the ones who had been built on expectation rather than on mutual respect. The ones who prospered only when she overgave, when she made herself available on demand, when she agreed to manage everyone else's emotions before taking care of her own. Without the free work of emotional labor, these relationships were at best transactional, but once it became visible, they couldn't unsee it. The resistance strengthened. The charge against her is selfishness, of keeping score, on withholding love, of creating distance. However, these charges were not relevant. She wasn't holding back on anything. She wasn't giving it to him for free anymore. Emotional labor, which is considered valuable, can be asked for, thanked for, and returned. Emotional labor, which is assumed, is considered a right. Entitlement falls apart when the availability is no longer certain. The system started recalibrating whether it wanted a connection badly enough to pay the price of emotional responsibility. Some chose to go on. Others felt that it didn't. It's because he has so far resisted the way. The economy of emotional labor had changed. That which had been unlimited had become finite. That which had been invisible had now been named. That which had been an expectation had been made optional. This did not make her less loving. It made her sustainable. She stopped feeling drained every time she interacted with other people. She slept better. She sensed a quiet emergence of joy in her life. Her capacity to feel, though, expanded, not because she was taking on more, but because she was taking on less for other people in order to take on more for herself. This further strengthened her determination. It dawned on her that free emotional labor had conditioned people to undervalue her humanity, to perceive her not as a human being, but as a resource. The reclaiming of it reinforced her humanity. And personhood alters the dynamic. They had to learn to interact with her as an equal, not as a supplier of emotional services. They had to learn to respect her boundaries or learn to be distant. This was not torture, it was maturity. The toll and suffering from keeping the old system in place had been too high. But now that toll was being shared more equitably, or not at all. That's when the real reckoning started. Because once emotional labor is no longer free, power balances change. This means that control diminishes. Then hierarchies are reduced, which essentially leads to a shift from dependency to choice. And choice changes everything. This stage wasn't loud. This stage wasn't dramatic. It's been slow, undeniable. Either things changed, or it's been obvious that a foundation didn't exist to support this sense of equality. The system now had a choice. Learn to share a sense of responsibility for the emotional accountability that came with it, or it would lose the individual who had been keeping things together. Not all people chose adaptation, and that loss, while painful, was clarifying, because it established the fact she had to learn. If a relationship is dependent on free emotional labor, it is no relationship. Non-humor version. This is basically a transaction that is masquerading as and she was no longer willing to pay that price. The change had become irreversible now. The boundary of emotional labor, an expense, decision, a choice. And once that line had been established, it became impossible to go back to the previous situation. The system would either grow up, meaning develop maturely into, or fall apart.
By the time this stage of the system was reached, the results of emotional labor no longer being free had moved from discomfort into consequence. What once felt like momentary tension now proved permanent change. Relationships were no longer coasting on habit, they were tested by reality. This is the phase where things either grow or break. The emotional economy had shifted, and not everyone knew how to survive inside it. Some tried returning to old patterns and hoped that through familiarity would come comfort. They spoke as if nothing had changed. They expected the same emotional availability, the same patience, the same willingness to absorb tension. The response they got, however, was different now. There was no rush to fix, no instinct to comfort, no automatic emotional translation. Instead, there was space, and space demands responsibility. Without free emotional labor cushioning every interaction, people were forced to confront their own emotional habits, how quickly they escalated, how often they dodged accountability, how dependent they were on someone else to regulate their reactions. For some, this was confronting in a productive way. They began to slow down, to be more deliberate in choosing words, to sit with discomfort rather than to outsource it. They realized emotional maturity wasn't innate, it was practiced. They adapted. They learned how to repair rather than how to divert. They listened instead of defending. They owned their emotions instead of projecting them. All that changed with these people. Connection became steadier, quieter, and far less draining. Emotional labor didn't disappear, it was shared. When something was hard, it got addressed together, not absorbed by one person alone. But others struggled much. They had perceived any boundaries as rejection, any silence was a punishment, any form of self-protection was selfishness. Of course they felt destabilized. An emotional hierarchy to which they had clung was no longer available. Without someone cushioning every moment, their own emotional limitations became visible and uncomfortable. Instead of adapting, they blamed. They were like, "You've changed. You don't care like you used to. That's just not how this relationship works." What they meant was simpler. This used to be easier for me. The invisibility of the emotional labor for so long now felt like loss when it was removed. Even though no one was taking anything, they were only repossessing themselves. This phase exposed a painful reality. Some relationships had been constructed not on a mutual concern, but on unequal emotional investment. As long as one person overfunctioned, the imbalance remained unseen. Once that overfunctioning ceased, the imbalance could no longer be denied. That's when distance appeared, but not as a punishment, rather as a result. Conferences became less frequent. Communications felt strained. The emotional adhesive had held it all together earlier, and with its absence, some ties simply couldn't hold on to their form. This was not failure, it was exposure. The system was showing what it had been all this time. For the person who had withdrawn free emotional labor, this stage was both stabilizing and heartbreaking. Stabilizing because her energy was finally her own. Heartbreaking because she saw clearly which connections depended on her exhaustion. It is in that realization where grief exists. Grief for the relationships she had thought that were. Grief for the time she had spent exerting to keep it alive. Grief for the hopes that someday it will all be evened out. But it also brought honesty. She stopped sentimentalizing sacrifice, stopped associating endurance with love, stopped believing that being needed meant being valued. She started valuing peace over proximity more. And that reordering of priorities changed everything. The system countered again, this time urgently. Appeals to sentiment increased. Guilt was revisited. They told her there would be consequences: loneliness, regret, disconnection. Boundaries were positioned as extreme, uncalled for, melodramatic. But those warnings fell flat, because fear no longer dictated her choices. This emotional labor had ceased being free not only from without, but also within. She no longer paid an emotional wage to monitor other people's reactions to her choices. She allowed discomfort to be present and didn't fix it. That in itself was revolutionary. She noticed how quickly situations resolved when she does not interfere, how the people adjust when forced, how conflict sometimes disappeared without her involvement at all.
She realized she had been overestimating the importance of her labor and underestimating everyone else's capability. The system had never needed her to do it all. It had tacitly relied on her willingness to do so. As time went on, a new normal developed in the realm of emotions, one that was built on independence rather than duty, consent rather than assumption, mutual accountability rather than silent sacrifice. This did little to alleviate the tension. It made it honest. Relationships that survived this stage were different, but stronger. They were built on respect, not convenience, on accountability, not assumption. Emotional labor flowed both ways, and when it didn't, space was allowed without the drama. Relationships that could not hold up died off naturally, not with explosions either, not with threats, with quiet withdrawal. But it was in the quietness that the most said. Nobody was running after anybody. Nobody was being convinced. No one was being held together against his will. It meant the system was readjusting itself around reality. For the first time, she felt emotionally solvent. She had reserves. She could choose where to invest her energy. She could say yes without resentment and no without guilt. That freedom was transforming. She wasn't hardened by the change. She was softened. Soft in the way that comes from safety, not self-erasure. The emotional labor she still gave was deliberate, chosen, valued. It was given in relationships that could hold it without exploiting it. And that distinction marked the true end of the old system. Because the old system relied upon emotional labor as free, limitless, and unprotested. Now it was finite. Now it was named. Now it was optional. That shift dismantled structures and hierarchies that had silently existed for years. It flattened power dynamics, removed emotional leverages, and replaced dependency with choices. It was a system which could no longer function as it had, and that was no tragedy. It was an evolution. Yet what would come next would be quieter still, but more final. Because once emotional labor has boundaries, the future cannot resemble the past.
By the time this system had reached this phase, there was little confusion over what had changed. The emotional readjustment was no longer theoretical. It was real. It was lived. People had accommodated or moved away. The frantic energy of resistance went away and gave place to something more silent, more honest. Acceptance. Not everyone welcomed such a change with open arms, but most accepted it over time, if only because there was no going back. Emotional labor was no longer involuntary, and no amount of social pressure could make it so again. The system had already reconstituted itself around a new reality. What became clear now was who people were, without the emotional buffer. For some, responsibility was a step into which they moved naturally. They didn't announce it. They just showed up differently. They checked their tone. They reflected before reacting. They apologized without being prompted. They learned how to hold space without expecting someone else to do it for them. These shifts were subtle but profound. Conversations slowed down. They became more intentional, less emotionally charged but more meaningful. There was less urgency to resolve everything immediately and more patience for the complex. Emotional labor, when it was given, felt like a gift, not an obligation. Other people never quite adjusted. They were still emotionally reactive. Now the reactions reverberated without reciprocation. Where earlier reassurance had been, there was silence. Where explanations had been, there was clarity without explication. Where mediation had been, there was distance. This wasn't punishment. It was consequence. She no longer pursued understanding from others. She did not feel responsible for how others framed her boundaries within their minds. She trusted that anyone who wanted connection badly enough would learn how to meet her where she stood. And some did, but many didn't. But most surprising to her was how peaceful the separation felt. There was sadness, yes, nostalgia too, but there was no chaos, no second guessing, no urge to reopen doors just to avoid discomfort. In the absence of emotional overextension, space opened up, space she didn't know she needed. It was there that she started hearing herself with greater clarity, her own preferences, her own limits, her own rhythms. She perceived how often she had overridden her instincts to accommodate people, how often she had minimized her needs to preserve harmony, how rarely she had asked whether a relationship was nourishing her or merely consuming her. Now, however, those were the questions guiding her choices. She didn't pull back from contact. She polished it. Relationships few deepened. Words few, words sincere. The exchange of feelings with other people felt less draining because it had been mutual. Conflicts arising could be discussed directly or allowed to pass without building into a fight. The cacophony of emotions that once had filled her days had quieted. And in that quiet, something unexpected occurred. Joy was back.
Not the boisterous performative joy she used to manufacture to reassure others, but a steady internal kind, the kind that comes from alignment, from living within one's capacity instead of beyond it. But also somehow, with the weight gone, heavier, less reactive, less vigilant, less preoccupied with balancing everyone else. That vigilance had been exhausting. She realized now how much energy she'd put into scanning for emotional threats, anticipating moods, preparing responses, adjusting herself constantly to avoid conflict. When emotional labor was no longer free, that vigilance dissolved. She trusted people to handle themselves, and if they couldn't, she trusted herself to step back. This phase wasn't dramatic, lent itself less well to the obvious storytelling of big confrontations or defining moments. There was just consistency. Boundaries intact, patterns stabilized, expectations reset. The system settled into its new equilibrium. This was where the illusion finally fell away. The illusion of self-erasure in love. It is the illusion that peace is something one person creates for everyone else. The illusion that emotional endurance equates to emotional maturity. She sees now that maturity goes both ways. Real attachment is mutual. Love cannot live long when responsibility rests only on one person. These realizations did not make her bitter. They made them discerning. She stopped investing in relationships that required her exhaustion. She stopped explaining herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. She stopped negotiating boundaries with people who benefited from her lack of them. This wasn't withdrawal. It was alignment. The system had changed, not because she had demanded that it should, but because she was no longer compensating for its flaws. Without her free emotional labor, the flaws were impossible to avoid. Some of them were repaired. Others weren't. And that was all right, because not everything is worth saving. Some things exist only for as long as there's someone willing to hold it together alone. It is when that willingness ends that the structure shows whether it can stand on its own. By now, the emotional economy was stable, not perfect, but honest. Those who stayed in it did so out of choice, not convenience. Emotional labor was exchanged knowingly, not presumed. This stability set the stage for the last realization, the one that comes only after the job is over. That is, understanding that reclaiming emotional labor doesn't just change relationships, it changes identity. Because in the moment you stop giving yourself away for free, you finally meet the version of yourself waiting underneath the labor all along.
By the time emotional labor was no longer free, something irreversible had already happened. The system had changed, yes, but more importantly, she had changed. Not in personality, not in values, in orientation. She was no longer positioned around other people's needs. She was positioned inside herself. That shift was subtle but permanent. For the first time, she wasn't measuring her worth by how useful she was to others. She wasn't scanning rooms for emotional tension. She wasn't preemptively apologizing, softening, adjusting, or carrying what wasn't hers. She was present but not available in the old way. And that made a difference. Once availability had defined her. She had been the emotional first responder, the listener, the translator, the stabilizer, the one to make things make sense when they didn't, the one who held space so others didn't have to confront themselves. Now she still was kind, but not consumable. She still cared, but not at the expense of her own well-being. This new iteration of care confused people at first. Some thought it was detachment, others thought it was indifference, but it was neither. It was discernment. It was consentful care, presence with a limit. And once those limits existed, they changed how people approached her. Others came more gingerly, more respectfully. They knew her emotional energy was no longer a guarantee, and with that knowledge came vetting, and with vetting, checks. The ones who showed up ready, who spoke their minds clearly, who owned up to their emotions before bringing those emotions into her space. Those conversations felt clean. Others stopped coming altogether, not because she pushed them away, but because without free emotional labor, the relationship required effort they weren't willing to give. Without someone absorbing their frustration, soothing their insecurity, or validating their behavior, they didn't know how to connect. That was an interesting absence. And releasing. What she began to fathom slowly and deeply was that free emotional labor doesn't just exhaust the giver, it arrests the growth of everyone else. It allows people to remain underdeveloped emotionally. It shields them from the consequences of their behavior. It prevents systems from maturing. In reclaiming her labor, she was not harming anyone. She was allowing reality to do its work. This realization dissolved the last of her guilt. All her life, she had assumed that stepping back equated to abandonment, that taking care of herself meant neglecting others, that boundaries were a way of rejection. It was now that she saw something closer to the truth.
Boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They allow the healthy to stay, that which is no good to wither away. She felt the lightness in life without being on emotional guard all the time. Her nervous system began to settle, her thoughts slowed, and her body stopped bracing for impact. The background anxiety she once thought was normal began to dissipate. Peace, she learned, is not passive. It is the absence of superfluous work. In that peace came clarity, fuller relationships built upon imbalance, not intimacy. How often she took intensity for closeness. How many connections had been placed upon her emotional output rather than mutual investment. She was not critical of herself for this. She honored the version of herself who did what she had to do to survive. But she was no longer living there. Now, when she did give emotional labor, it was conscious. It was giving where it was witnessed, appreciated, and reciprocated. It was shared, not extracted. She could engage deeply without losing herself. She could support without sacrificing. That shift redefined love. No longer did it appear that love was endurance. To love had ceased to be self-neglect. Love was no longer the absence of voice in the presence of violations. Love became mutual presence. She stopped believing that for something to be real, it needed to be hard. She stopped confusing familiarity with safety. She stopped equating longevity with health. She did not force the closure, allowing things to come to an end. And that was perhaps the most radical change of all. Ends no longer needed justifications. She didn't need everyone to understand her choices. She didn't need agreement to move forward. She trusted that alignment mattered more than approval. This trust grounded her. This emotional labor she had once given so freely had shaped her identity, made her adaptable, perceptive, empathetic. Those traits didn't disappear when she took back her labor. They grew up. Empathy no longer required self-erasure. Perception no longer meant hypervigilance. Adaptability no longer meant shrinking. They became tools rather than duties. As time went on, the old system faded from relevance. Not with drama, not with bitterness. It simply lost hold. The expectations dissolved, the roles expired, the emotional contracts that had bound her quietly lapsed. Nobody renewed them. And in that exhalation, room expanded. Space to choose the relationships that feel reciprocal. Space for building a life that didn't call for relentless emotional output. Space to rest without guilt. Space to be fully human. She didn't replace the old system with a new one. Instead, she provided autonomy. That autonomy didn't isolate her. It aligned her. People who entered her life now met her as an equal. They didn't come looking to be carried. They came ready to walk beside her. Emotional exchanges felt grounded, not urgent. Conflict felt workable, not threatening. Stability did not need to be carried out any longer. Stability did exist. Because in hindsight, she saw the moment things changed. Not the first boundary, not the first no, but the moment she stopped believing she owed emotional labor simply because she always gave it. It was that belief that had kept her trapped. It was a crucial piece of their lives, but letting it go set her free. This was not a dramatic ending. It was sustainable. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself, yet quietly reshapes everything that comes after. It's the kind that does not demand recognition, but changes the quality of every interaction that follows. Emotional labor was no longer free. And because of that, it was finally respected. It didn't collapse completely. It evolved, and she did just that. What was left wasn't void, but balance. Not silence, but peace. Not disconnection, but clarity. And in that clarity, she found something she had never been given permission to prioritize before: herself.